So we're now going to have KJ Noh talk about what the United States is doing against the rest of the world. KJ is a peace activist, journalist, and scholar specializing in the geopolitics of the Asian continent. He writes for Asia Times, Counterpunch, Dissident Voice, and other publications. He's a special correspondent for KPFA on the pivot to Asia, the Koreas, and the Pacific. KJ is a South Korean Army veteran and a member of Veterans for Peace and a co-founder of Pivot to Peace, which is a coalition of both the Chinese community and a number of peace organizations. You can find Pivot to Peace at the website peacepivot.org. KJ, welcome.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to Matt and Ken for your brilliant presentations. I'm just going to cut straight to the chase. The ruling class is preparing for war with China. Let me say that again. The ruling class is preparing for war, kinetic war with China. How do we know this? Because those of us who've been in the peace community know that there are very distinct steps and markers that we can notice as the US escalates to war. We all know the first step is information war. That is to say, there is an ideological and narrative preparation to prepare the population for war. So we see the manufacturing of consent in the demonization and the threat inflation that we are barraged with nonstop about China. And ideally, you want to have something which is a WMD level, an existential threat, a genocidal threat. And you see this type of mendacity being tossed out, in particular about Xinjiang. And so the second earmark of information war is that you will also see attacks on peace activists. That is, they will be accused of working for the other side. In other words, working for peace is working for the other side. In other words, we are on the side of war. And if you work for peace, you're working for the other side. This is very similar to when actually war happens. You want to take out all the air defense and turn it into a no-fly zone. Before you even do that, you want to turn the public arena into a no-think zone, a no critical thinking zone, no peace activism zone. You do not want anybody to exercise critical self-defense. So that's another signal that you know that we're very close to war. And literally, we have to think of information war as the pre-kinetic dimension of war. And the last thing I'll point out is we actually have calendared dates. General Minahan said 2025. Admiral Davidson said 2027. It's probably somewhere in that range, but we know that it's not a question of if, but when. The second step, as you watch the US escalate to war, is shaping the theater. The US never likes to go to war. It never likes to wage a fair fight. It wants to preset and pre-shape the theater as much as possible. It's the way in which a bullfighter will put everything in their favor before they bring the bull into the bullfighting arena. And so you see the war alliances that are being built up. That's the Quad, AUKUS, JACUS, JAFUS. NATO is coming to Asia. You see all the legislative preparations and appropriations. I'm talking the Taiwan Enhanced Resiliency Act, the Philippine Enhanced Resiliency Act. These are all acts of war. And then you see the intense logistics and pre-positioning of troops and material, fuel, weapons, troops. And you see granular, intense, aggressive, concrete exercises. For example, in Korea last year, they had 200 days of war games, 20 strategic bombing exercises, and the troops are on the ground, are literally rehearsing the capture and the transfer of POWs. These are not normal exercises. These are very, very granular, very, very aggressive exercises that you would only do if you were literally preparing for war. The third step you will always see is provocation, because the US always wants to wrong foot the other side. And so we see these constant phone ops, freedom operations in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. And just to put the shoe on the other foot, imagine if Chinese troops or if Chinese ships were floating, miles from Florida or California. There are already troops and weapons on Taiwan Island. In particular, Tomahawks are being prepared. And also, we already have special warfare forces on Taiwan's Jinmen Island. Jinmen Island is 3 kilometers away from the Chinese mainland. It is within a visual distance. It's within sniper distance of Taiwan. So once again, put the shoe on the other foot. Imagine if you had PLA special forces on Martha's Vineyard or Galveston Island or Alcatraz Island. What signal would that send? Clearly, this is provocation. We're also seeing these aggressive, quote unquote, resupply exercises that could trigger mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. We see the constant rehearsal of decapitation exercises in Korea. 2nd Infantry Division Indian Head is doing very, very aggressive maneuvers with the Capital Mechanized Division. These are aggressive divisions that are designed to go in and attack. And these maneuvers are being done out of place. So very, very unusual maneuvers, very, very aggressive maneuvers. And as I said, non-stop war exercises. 200 days of exercises last year. We have at least another 180 days of exercises prepared this year. This is constant escalation, but more than that, it is constant provocation. For those of you, you may already know this, just to go, this is not something that came out of the blue. There is a clear history to this. 1992 Defense Planning Guidance document, Wolf Aware says that we are going to control the world. This becomes the Project for a New American Century in 1997. Essentially, we are going to control the world, and we're going to wage aggressive war to ensure that we continue to be the boss of the world. This is absorbed into the Bush Doctrine, and then it becomes part of the Obama Doctrine as created by the Center for New American Security, which are simply the new neocons. This is Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy and 18 other top cabinet officials who are currently in the Biden administration. In 2009, the US plans the doctrine of war against China. It is called air-sea battle. Air-sea battle comes out of the Soviet doctrine of war, air-land battle. The US, the NATO doctrine of war against the USSR called air-land battle. Most of us don't know air-land battle unless we served in Europe at that time, but we know the words shock and awe. The colloquial term for air-land battle is air-sea battle. The US has prepared shock and awe for China since 2009. Air-land battle itself comes out of Israeli war doctrine during the Yom Kippur War. Essentially, it says that there is no difference between the front and the rear, no distinction between war, between military and civilian objectives, and it engages in deep strikes far into the rear in order to decapitate the enemy. It is a very, very dangerous and deadly doctrine of war. This was prepared since 2009. In 2011, after preparing the doctrine of war, they prepared the official declaration, Pivot to Asia, Encirclement of China. In 2015, they came up with an economic doctrine of war, which had been prepared for 5 years before, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump vetoed that, but he created his own trade war. And then when Biden came back into power, he rebranded the Pivot to Asia as the Indo-Pacific Strategy. He rebranded the Trans-Pacific Partnership as the Indo-Pacific Economic Strategy. And he started chip wars, sanctions, and COVID wars. Let me say a few words about COVID war, because this is a good example of the information war. The US, during the height of COVID, spent a lot of energy and work using social media companies to convince the people of the Philippines that the vaccines that they were getting from China were not halal, that they were made with pork and that they were inefficient, that they were not effective, and that this was actually a Chinese, attempt to poison them. The result of that, the Philippines had the lowest vaccination rates of any country in Southeast Asia, and they had some of the highest death rates. We think somewhere in the range of 50,000 dead. They also said masks don't work, non-pharmaceutical interventions don't work. Essentially, they were happy to see tens of thousands of Filipinos die, and other countries in the area, people die, if it meant that they could discredit China just a little bit. This has recently been revealed in a Reuters news article. The question that I sometimes get asked is, why do the ruling class think they can go to war? They're already engaged in one proxy war. There's another war which is brewing, a genocide, which looks like it could turn into a regional war in the Middle East. Why do they think that they can engage in a third war? And do they really think they could win? The way to understand this is you have to understand something called the third offset. In war, in grand strategy of war, there is this rock, paper, scissors game called offsets. The first offset is mass. Essentially, if the other side has more conventional forces, you want more mass. In other words, you want a bigger bomb. And this is the nuclear offset. The first offset is nuclear weapons. This is what the US used against the Soviet Union when it was facing off against the stronger, more powerful conventional forces of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not long behind in creating its own nuclear weapons. And so then that required another offset against nuclear weaponry, which was cruise missiles. The idea behind cruise missiles is that you can shoot these missiles on their platforms before they can launch, or later you can shoot them down as they travel through, as they move through their trajectory. So the second offset is really precision. The idea is that precision beats mass. But it wasn't long before the Soviet Union and also China also had its own second offset. China has incredible capacity in long-range standoff precision missiles. And so what the US has built out now is what they call the third offset. This is something that CNAS has built out for a long time. And the idea of the third offset is that when you attack, you distribute your forces. You have diffuse attacks. You have dispersed attacks. The best example of this is the use of drones, network drones, in the Ukraine war. So once again, first offset is nuclear weapons. The second offset, precision, is cruise missiles. The third offset is network drones. This is what we're looking at right now. So the US believes that using the third offset, it can wage war and it can defeat China. This is the replicator program. This is all the subsurface stuff, the automated AI-based networked joint arms doctrine. They really believe that they can win this war. And they also plan to use as many proxies as possible. That includes South Korea. South Korea, 600,000 troops and 3 million reserve troops. That is 3.6 million troops. That's a lot of manpower that you can throw into a war. And the US has operational control over South Korean troops, over all of them. It gets them for free. That's incredible moral hazard. There's also JACUS, there's Japan, Korea, US. The US is currently working to get operational control over Japanese troops as well. They just announced a joint operations control, and they want a South Korea type operational control over Japanese troops. Japan is already the 5th most powerful military in the world. Soon it will be the 3rd most powerful because it will have the 3rd largest military budget. They will also use Taiwan. Taiwan has increased its mandatory conscription from 4 months to 1 year. They'll be using Philippine troops. They'll be Australian because they always use the Australians, the Anzac troops, and they're also bringing NATO into theater. And they've already implemented the NATO tactical data system called Link 16. They've distributed that to all US alliance partners, including Taiwan Island. The US ruling class is sending the message right now. If you read foreign policy or if you read the elite journals, they're saying prepare for industrial war. The Council on Foreign Relations is saying we need to put the country on industrial war footing right now. They're also saying we need to prepare the population for mass casualties. And they estimate that the casualties will be in the range of 21,000 casualties per week. That is, 2 weeks will be more than decades of war in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And because of this, they're retraining medics to do mass industrial triage, no longer the kind of boutique medical care that we saw during Iraq and Afghanistan. They're preparing them to do industrial level triage. And they're also saying that we need to bring back the draft in some form, because you cannot sustain 21,000 casualties without some kind of a draft. That draft will probably involve first of all, refugees and immigrants. CNAS is saying prepare for a long, protracted war. Also, regarding industrial capacity, they're trying to get Japan, India, and Korea to do the military industrial production for them. And that's actually not a hard call, because Japanese corporations, they actually grew out of the Japanese industrial military machine prior to World War II. The big Korean companies like Hyundai, they were actually military subcontractors to the US, to Halliburton during the Vietnam War. Hanwha is also a very, very important military contractor. Currently, as we speak, South Korea has provided more shells to the Ukraine war than all of Europe combined. And so the proxies are gearing up. And they're also getting India to prepare for the complex and high level intense industrial production for US war. In particular, they're going to build US jet engines in India. And they've already made agreements with Korean shipyards to fix immediate battle damage to ships in Korean shipyards. And so all of this is very, very advanced. It's very, very kind of granularly thought through. And of course, there's this constant process of reshoring and friendshoring that the US also wants to do in order to make its entire supply chains war-proof. The question is why, and we spoke a little bit about the geostrategic dimensions. To put that very simply, as Matt put it, it is about greed. It is about this desire to dominate. But let me add another dimension to this. It's not simply oil, or it's not simply the military-industrial complex. It really has to do with the fact that the imperial core has lived off the global south for centuries. But in particular, in the last century and in this century, it lives as kind of landlords over the rest of the poor global south. It is a rentier economy. The US economy is mostly financialized, and it simply draws tribute and wealth from the global south. How much? Well, it gets 162 trillion, according to certain estimates, from 1960. That is, the US has gotten 162 trillion, around $2 trillion every year for free from the global south. It lives beyond its means. It lives off credit. When it gets stuff, it gives worthless paper to these countries because it has the global reserve currency. And in order to make sure that people continue to accept this worthless paper, they need to reinforce it with military dominance. It is what Thomas Friedman said, the invisible hand of capitalism works only with the mailed fist of military might. McDonald's needs McDonnell Douglas. These things go together. So the US is like the Blanche Dubois of empires. It is living on the kindness of strangers, but behind that, it exerts tremendous military force in order to continue to extract that wealth from the global south. And it does not want to give that up. And so it's a little bit like an addict. You know, if you ever know somebody who is an addict, you'll know that they will do crazy things in order to feed their addiction. That addiction is an addiction for power. It is an addiction for this lifestyle that they've gotten accustomed to. But just as the addict will do insane, crazy, violent things, the US is addicted to power, and it is ready to go to war to maintain that power because China presents a threat. It presents a threat of the global South breaking away from this parasitic relationship that the US has had for decades. And so we can think of it as, you know, like the gambler who's losing everything, lost everything, and they just want to gamble one more time, place one huge bet because they think they can win it all back. That bet is nuclear war. Or it's like the bar drunk, you know, the bar is closing, the credit cards are starting to be refused, the lights are on, and they're supposed to go home. The bartender has made the last call, and the bar drunk does not want to go home. He's drunk with power, and he wants a fight. He will not go home without a fight. In fact, he will fight everybody in the bar. Or, if you want, you can think of a school shooter, except it's not just a school. It is the entire world that this shooter is willing to shoot up. Now, just to bring this back to reality, the US cannot win this war. China is more powerful, more determined, and it's fighting in its home court. It will not give up everything that it has accomplished simply on US threats. Almost all US war games show that the US loses over and over and over again. But more than that, the US already has the experience of fighting war with China. This was the Korean War. This was actually the first time that the US fought China directly. And China at the time was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had already fought 2 decades of civil war. It was broken. They didn't have any material. And through sheer force of will, they defeated the United States and gave them the largest battlefield retreat in American military history. Just one example, the Battle of Triangle Hill was one of the most intense set-piece battles of the Korean War. The Chinese call it the Battle of Shanganglin. Okay, this is a hill that was 2 square miles, and there was probably 1 or 2 companies of Chinese holding the hill. The US and the ROK military sent multiple divisions to take the hill, and they bombarded it with 2 million bombs, 2 square miles, and they dropped 2 million bombs on that area. The Chinese at the end were fighting with rocks. There's actually footage of them just out of ammunition and throwing rocks. And the US still lost. And they never fought a set-piece battle after that in the Korean War. After that, it was just movements towards, you know, a peace settlement. So the US cannot win this war. It could not win the war 70 plus years ago. It cannot win now. And so this is absolute madness. But the problem is the ruling imperial class, they would rather see the end of the world than the end of their power and privilege. And so that is the danger. That's the problem we're facing right now. I just want to say a few more words about what we could learn from China, what we could gain from China if we were to have good relations, if we didn't go down the path of peace. Ken has already mentioned about mutual security, peaceful development through the civilizational security and development initiatives. These are very, very well thought out plans. They essentially envision a just, harmonious world built on peace with win-win relations for everybody. This is very well thought out, and it is a powerful and inspirational project that China is trying to engage the rest of the world with, including the United States. I should also mention China's extraordinary steps that it has taken to prevent global warming and to transition to a sustainable economic development. It has already hit peak carbon, and we expect it to diminish its carbon emissions. And this is years ahead of its original targets. It has the greatest EV development in the world, which the US is putting 100% tax on. You can't get Chinese EVs, but they're building cheap, extraordinary EVs for everybody. They have extraordinary development in solar, wind, water, safe nuclear. They're essentially paving a path to sustainable development and sustainable energy development. And they're showing proof of concept. They're making it happen. This is not some, hyped over, PR stunt. This is really, really extraordinary stuff. It gives the world hope. And what China is doing will reduce global warming by 0.2, 0.3 degrees centigrade, which may not seem like much, but in this situation where every fraction of a degree is important, if every country or a few countries or the major countries did what China did, we would be able to deal with global warming. We would no longer be facing an existential threat. So that's the first thing. The second thing is poverty alleviation. China has shown proof of concept that poverty is a choice. You don't have to have poverty. It's not like what the Bible says, the poor will always be with us. Poverty is a policy choice. And the Chinese have shown that you can end it. They got rid of extreme poverty for 850 million people. That is probably the greatest accomplishment, or at least one of the greatest accomplishments in human history. And if you go to China, you can see that. Anywhere you go to the third world or developing world, you will see slums and homeless. But anywhere you go in China, look for the homeless, look for the poor, look for the slums. You cannot see it. They have ended extreme poverty, and they intend to bring the rest of the poor people up into the middle class. This is kind of an extraordinary example of what good policy and good economic planning looks like. And then last but not least, this is something that most people don't know, but currently in the US, we have a huge fentanyl problem, a huge opioid problem, 100,000 people dying from overdoses. This is a huge problem. We need to stop this. There is a model that has been pioneered before us. The country that had the greatest drug problem on the planet was China. When it was liberated in 1949, somewhere between 20 to 30% of its population was addicted to opium, because the West had built its wealth by trafficking opium to China since the Opium Wars in the mid-1800s. So China had the greatest drug problem on the planet, over 100 million addicts. And within 3 years, they got rid of that. How did they get rid of that? It's not rocket science. They gave everybody property, land reform. They gave everybody resources. And then they created community for everybody. And they gave them hope, and they gave them meaning, and they brought them together. And within 3 years, China's drug problem was finished. So these are some of the things that we could learn from China. We could have a much, much better economy. We could be free of drug problems. We could even move towards freedom from global climate catastrophe. So what do we have to do? We have to understand your mind right now is a terrain of war. The US military sees space as a theater of war. They're talking about cyberspace. They're talking about the exosphere, the outer space, and they also see mental space as a theater of war. They want to have narrative dominance over your mind, and they want to establish that it is necessary to go to war. This is the pre-kinetic dimension of war. Our first duty is not to allow our minds to be occupied by US military narratives. Don't allow your mind to be colonized. Think critically. fight the narratives of inevitability and demonization. You have to resist and coordinate together. Despair is not an option. Thank you.